asked the bartender for something strong. He gave me more than just a drink. I thought I just needed something to take the edge off, a drink strong enough to numb the loneliness creeping into my marriage. But what I got was far more intoxicating than whiskey, and far more dangerous. What happens when a moment of weakness turns into something you can't walk away from? Before we dive into this unforgettable story, make sure to subscribe to my channel for more real, gripping stories like this one. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from today? I asked the bartender for something strong. He gave me more than just a drink. The first sip burned in a way I welcomed, a slow, numbing fire curling its way down my throat, momentarily silencing the noise in my head. I sat at the dimly lit bar, fingers tracing the rim of my glass, watching the amber liquid swirl under the neon glow of the liquor shelves. The music was low, a deep blues melody humming through the speakers, setting the kind of mood that invited people to drink their regrets away. I wasn't here for the company, nor for the cheap flirtations that often happened in places like this. I was here because I needed something I couldn't quite name, something my husband no longer provided. I had been married to Mark for 10 years, a decade of what had once been passion, excitement, a love that felt untouchable. But love was a tricky thing. It didn't just disappear overnight. It unraveled slowly, thread by thread, until one day you woke up and realized you were living with a stranger. Mark had become a ghost in our home, buried in work, his affections rationed like a paycheck barely covering rent. At first I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that marriages had phases, that people got comfortable, that the fire naturally dimmed with time. But when was the last time he had actually looked at me? Not just seen me, but looked, with hunger, with appreciation, with that unmistakable desire that once set my skin on fire. I couldn't remember. The bartender's voice pulled me from my thoughts. I glanced up, meeting his gaze for the first time. He was younger than I expected, but there was an edge to him. Dark hair falling just slightly over piercing blue eyes, a stubble-dusted jaw that hinted at a roughness he didn't bother to hide. His name tag read, Jake. I nodded, pushing my glass toward him. Make it strong. A slow smirk curved his lips as he reached for a bottle. Rough night? Rough life, I murmured, watching as he poured, his hands steady, confident. There was something about the way he moved, intentional, unhurried, as if he knew the weight of anticipation. Let me guess, he said, setting the drink in front of me. Husband's an asshole, you don't feel seen, you start questioning everything but don't know what you're looking for. I stiffened slightly, my fingers tightening around the glass. That's a hell of an assumption. Jake leaned in slightly, resting his forearms on the bar. Not really. You'd be surprised how many women come in here with that exact same look in their eyes. I exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking my head. And what look is that? The look of someone who's starving, he said, voice dropping just a notch lower. Not for food, not even for attention, but for something real, something that makes them feel again. His words settled between us, heavy and unspoken, yet completely understood. I should have been offended, should have pushed back, told him he was wrong. But he wasn't. I took a sip of my drink, feeling the heat spread through me, warming more than just my skin. And what about you, Jake? What are you starving for? His eyes lingered on mine for a beat too long before he exhaled a soft chuckle, shaking his head. I stopped being hungry a long time ago. The rain had started outside, heavy drops tapping against the windows, turning the neon lights into blurred streaks of color. The bar had thinned out, leaving only a few scattered souls drowning their own miseries. Jake moved behind the counter, drying a glass with slow, deliberate movements, his gaze flicking back to me every so often. "Why do you stay?" he asked suddenly. I frowned. Stay where? In a marriage that doesn't touch you anymore, he said. In a house that feels colder than the night outside. I swallowed hard, the truth lodging itself somewhere between my throat and my chest. Because leaving would mean admitting it's over. And I don't know if I'm ready for that. Jake set the glass down, his expression unreadable. Sometimes it's already over before you admit it. A silence stretched between us, thick and charged with something I wasn't sure how to name. The air felt heavier, the room smaller, as if the entire world had shrunk down to just this bar, just this moment. He poured himself a drink, something I assumed he wasn't supposed to do, and lifted it slightly. To things we can't admit. I hesitated before clinking my glass against his, the sound sharp in the quiet space. As I drank, I felt the weight of his gaze on me, unflinching, searching. There was something different about Jake. He wasn't just playing a role, wasn't just another bartender looking to charm his way into someone's bed. He was studying me, reading between the lines of everything I wasn't saying. You're not just looking for a drink tonight, he said finally. I exhaled a slow breath, setting my glass down with a soft clink. No, I admitted. I don't think I am. Jake nodded slightly, as if he already knew the answer. The rain outside grew heavier, drowning out the sounds of the world beyond this place. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir inside me, something dangerous, something exhilarating. Jake didn't look away. Neither did I. Neither of us moved. But we both knew something had already shifted, and there was no going back. The rain outside became a steady hum, a quiet percussion against the windows of the bar, but inside, everything felt unnervingly still. The weight of what I'd just admitted sat between Jake and me, neither of us acknowledging it aloud, but both of us fully aware that we had crossed an invisible threshold. My fingers toyed with the rim of my glass, my heart beating a little too fast for the slow, bluesy tune playing from the jukebox in the corner. It wasn't just the whiskey warming me anymore. It was something else entirely. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Jake's gaze never wavered. He wasn't the type of man who looked away when things got uncomfortable. If anything, he seemed to lean into the tension, testing it, tasting it, waiting to see what I would do. His confidence wasn't cocky, wasn't the kind of practiced charm I had encountered before. It was something more dangerous. Something effortless, rooted deep in a man who knew exactly who he was and had long stopped apologizing for it. You're thinking too much, he murmured, pouring himself another drink, slow and deliberate. You don't strike me as the type of woman who overthinks things. I let out a soft, bitter laugh. I used to be impulsive, wild even, but life has a way of knocking that out of you. Jake tilted his head slightly, studying me. Or maybe you let it. I frowned, my grip tightening around the glass. That's not fair. Isn't it? He leaned against the bar, his arms crossed, those sharp blue eyes pinning me in place. You don't seem like a woman who just lets things happen to her, Laura. But here you are, sitting in a bar, staring into a drink like you're waiting for it to give you the answer you already know. His words hit too close, striking a nerve I wasn't ready to face. I looked down, watching the ice melt into my whiskey, diluting it, watering it down, just like I had let myself become, diluted, softened, made smaller by years of compromises, by the slow erosion of desire. I don't know what I'm doing here, I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. Jake reached for the bottle, refilled my glass. Yeah, you do. The words lingered in the air between us, challenging and certain, and the worst part was, he was right. I did know. I had known the moment I walked through the door, the moment I let myself enjoy the way he looked at me, the moment I realized that I was desperate for something, anything, to make me feel alive again. I thought about Mark, about how he hadn't even noticed I was gone, about how I could walk into a room naked and still feel invisible. I thought about the way I used to laugh, really laugh, the kind that made my stomach ache and my cheeks hurt. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt that way. Jake was still watching me, waiting. His patience was unnerving, like he had all the time in the world for me to come to my own conclusions. "You do this often?" I asked, lifting my glass to my lips, needing something to cut through the tension curling around my ribs. "Would I sit here and psychoanalyze lonely women?" His lips quirked slightly, amusement flickering in his eyes. "Only the interesting ones." I rolled my eyes, but there was no real bite behind it. "You must see a lot of women like me." "Do you mean married women looking for something they lost?" His voice was even, unreadable. I nodded, taking another sip. "Oh," he admitted after a moment. "I do." I wasn't sure why that stung. Maybe because it made me feel predictable, like I was just another sad, neglected wife looking for validation in the bottom of a whiskey glass. I set my drink down harder than necessary. "Well, I hate to break it to you, but I'm not like—" Jake's smirk deepened. "If you say so." Something about his tone set me on edge, made my pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with anger. He wasn't pushing me, wasn't trying to convince me of anything, but somehow his words still felt like a dare. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair, suddenly restless. The bar had emptied out even more, leaving only a few stragglers in the booths, lost in their own worlds. The air felt heavier now, thick with something unspoken. Jake leaned in slightly, just enough to close the space between us without actually touching me. "Tell me something, Laura," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "When was the last time you wanted something just for yourself?" The question shouldn't have made my breath catch, but it did. I parted my lips, ready to answer, but the words wouldn't come, because I didn't know, because I really didn't know. Jake didn't push. He just watched, waiting, letting the silence stretch until I felt like I was unraveling right there on the bar stool. I swallowed hard. "What are you doing?" His lips barely moved. "I don't know. What am I doing?" My heart hammered against my ribs. This was dangerous. This was reckless. This was wrong. But it was also the first time in years that I had felt like a woman, rather than just somebody's wife. The realization settled into my bones, warm and electric and terrifying. Jake's eyes flickered to my lips, just for a second before meeting my gaze again. "I should go," I whispered, though I made no move to leave. "Probably," but neither of us moved. The rain continued to fall outside, the neon lights casting shadows across the floor, and the air between us was charged, humming with something I wasn't ready to name. And then, in the smallest, quietest moment, I felt it, his fingers brushing against mine on the bar, the lightest, briefest touch. A touch that could change everything. Or maybe a touch that already had. Jake didn't move his hand away, and neither did I. It was the smallest thing, really. His fingers brushing against mine on the smooth wood of the bar, nothing more than a whisper of contact. But it set something off inside me, something I had buried for too long. It had been years since I had felt the heat of another man's skin, years since I had let myself indulge in the simple pleasure of physical connection, and yet here I was, holding my breath over something so small, so insignificant, or maybe it wasn't insignificant at all. I should have pulled back. I should have shaken off whatever this was and reminded myself that I was a married woman, that I had a husband waiting for me at home, even if he hardly noticed when I was gone. But I didn't. Instead, I let the moment stretch between us, let my fingers stay where they were, let myself pretend, just for a little while, that I was free to want this, free to want him. Jake's gaze flickered up to mine, sharp and knowing. He wasn't the type of man who second-guessed himself, wasn't the type to hesitate or waver. He moved with purpose, spoke with intent, and I got the distinct feeling that if I gave him permission, he would do whatever he damn well pleased. And the most terrifying part? I didn't think I would stop him. "You're thinking again," he murmured, his voice rough, almost amused. I swallowed hard, forcing a smirk to my lips. "And that's a bad thing?" "It is when it stops you from doing what you really want." A shiver ran down my spine, slow and deliberate, making my skin tighten in places I had long forgotten could still react this way. His fingers, still barely touching mine, curled slightly, like he was testing the weight of this moment, waiting to see how far I would let it go. I could have pulled away. I could have laughed it off, downed the rest of my drink, and walked out of the bar with my dignity intact, but I didn't move. "You talk like you know me," I said, tilting my head slightly, challenging him. "I know the way you look at me," he countered, his eyes locked onto mine, unwavering. "Like you're starving for something you won't let yourself have." A breath hitched in my throat, my pulse hammering against my ribs. His words were too close to the truth, too precise, cutting through every lie I had been telling myself. It wasn't just the way he looked at me, the way his voice curled around my thoughts and wrapped them into something dangerous. It was the way he saw me, stripped down past the layers I had built, past the careful composure I clung to so desperately. I didn't realize how close we were sitting until I felt his breath against my skin, warm and slow. The air between us felt charged, thick with something I wasn't ready to name. I was playing with fire, and I knew it, but for the first time in years, I wanted to burn. "Jake," I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice over the pounding of my heart. His fingers brushed over mine again, this time more intentional, more deliberate. It wasn't a question, it was an invitation, one I knew I shouldn't accept. "I should go," I said, though my body refused to move. His lips curled slightly, his voice low and steady. "Then, go." But he knew I wouldn't, we both did. The moment stretched between us, pulsing, electric. The sounds of the bar had faded into the background, leaving just us, just this, just the weight of something neither of us could take back. I should have felt guilty. I should have thought about Mark, about our vows, about everything I was about to throw away for a fleeting moment of selfishness. But the truth was, my marriage had already crumbled. The pieces had been falling apart for years, and I had spent so much time trying to hold them together that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply let go. Jake reached for my drink, his fingers brushing against the rim of the glass before pushing it gently toward me. "One more," he murmured, his voice like silk over gravel. "Then you decide." I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my skin burning under the weight of his gaze. I should have said no. I should have walked away before it was too late. But instead, I reached for the glass, wrapping my fingers around it, feeling the condensation slip against my skin. Jake watched me, patient, waiting. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding, he was just there, offering me something I had convinced myself I didn't deserve anymore, the chance to feel something real. I lifted the drink to my lips, took a slow sip, let the burn settle deep in my chest. And then, without another word, I set the glass down and made my choice. I stood, my heart pounding, my legs unsteady. Jake didn't move, just watched me with that same unreadable expression, waiting. "Take me somewhere," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His smirk was slow, deliberate. "You sure?" "No," but I nodded anyway. He didn't ask again. He simply stood, tossing a rag over his shoulder before leading me toward the back of the bar, through a door I hadn't noticed before. My breath felt tight in my lungs, my nerves humming, anticipation coiling in my stomach like a living thing. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a neon sign that buzzed softly overhead. Jake moved with the same quiet confidence he always did, his fingers brushing against mine as we walked, sending shivers down my spine. He didn't pull me into him, didn't rush. He just let me follow, let me make the choice, let me decide how far I was willing to go. We stopped at another door, and for a moment he hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "Last chance," he murmured, his voice rougher now, laced with something I couldn't quite place. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering. I knew what this meant, knew there was no coming back from it. But when I looked into his eyes, I didn't see hesitation. I saw heat. I saw hunger. I saw everything I had been missing. So I reached for the handle, and I stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind us, sealing me into the quiet, dimly lit space of Jake's loft above the bar. The air was thick with the scent of whiskey and something undeniably masculine. Wood, smoke, a hint of something darker, something that belonged only to him. My heart pounded against my ribs, my breath shallow as I stood there in the middle of the room, feeling the weight of the moment press down on me. There was no turning back now. No excuses, no way to rewrite this night into something innocent. I had made my choice the second I followed him through that door. Jake didn't rush. He didn't pounce the way I half expected him to, the way I might have wanted him to. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching me with those knowing eyes, his fingers lazily toying with the edge of a glass he had left there earlier. The silence stretched between us, humming with an anticipation so thick it felt like a living thing, wrapping around my throat, making it impossible to breathe. "You nervous?" His voice was quiet, rough, cutting through the tension like a blade. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Should I be? His lips curled slightly, the ghost of a smirk. "I don't know, should you?" The way he looked at me, the way he held himself with that effortless confidence, made me feel like I was the one who was unraveling, the one who had lost control. And maybe I had. Maybe I had given up control the second I let him touch me back at the bar, the second I let myself imagine what it would feel like to be wanted again. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. "I don't do this," I admitted, though the words felt thin, useless. Jake nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. "I know." That was the thing about him. He didn't just listen to what I said. He heard what I didn't say. He understood me in a way that made my chest ache, made me wonder if I had ever really been seen before. He pushed away from the counter, crossing the room slowly, deliberately. Every step sent a new wave of electricity through my body, tightening every nerve, coiling the tension so tight I thought I might snap. He stopped just in front of me, close enough that I could feel the heat of him, but he didn't touch me. "Not yet." "Tell me to stop," he murmured. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out, because I didn't want him to stop. I wanted this, needed to remember what it felt like to be needed. His hand lifted, fingers tracing along my jaw, slow and careful, like he was memorizing the shape of me. I leaned into the touch without thinking, my eyes fluttering shut as a shudder ran through me. It had been so long since I had felt something as simple as this. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to," Jake murmured, his breath warm against my skin. "But if you want this," I didn't let him finish, didn't let myself think. Instead, I closed the space between us, pressing my lips to his, my fingers fisting in the fabric of his shirt, like I was afraid he might disappear. He let out a quiet groan against my mouth, his hands sliding down to my waist, pulling me flush against him. It wasn't a sweet kiss, it wasn't careful or hesitant. It was desperate, consuming, a collision of want and need and something far more dangerous. My body responded before my mind could catch up, my fingers slipping under his shirt, feeling the hard lines of muscle beneath my touch. Jake's grip tightened, his hands roaming over my back, my hips, pulling me closer, pressing me into him like he couldn't get enough. My head was spinning, drowning in the way he felt, the way he tasted, the way he wanted me. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this was wrong. Knew I would hate myself in the morning. Knew that I was breaking something I could never fix. But right now, in this moment, none of that mattered. Right now, I wasn't a neglected wife. I wasn't a woman drowning in a loveless marriage. Right now, I was alive. Jake lifted me effortlessly, carrying me toward the bed without breaking the kiss, laying me down against the sheets with a care that contradicted the raw hunger in his touch. His lips trailed down my neck, slow and deliberate, sending shivers racing through me. My fingers tangled in his hair, my body arching into him, needing more, more, more. I wasn't thinking anymore, I was feeling. And for the first time in years, that was enough. The night blurred into a fever dream of tangled sheets, whispered confessions, and the kind of passion I had forgotten could exist. Jake didn't just touch me, he worshipped me, unraveled me, put me back together in ways I hadn't known I needed. He made me forget, made me remember, made me feel. And when it was over, when we lay tangled together in the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains, I didn't feel guilt. I felt free. For the first time in 10 years, I felt free. But freedom, like everything else, comes with a price. And I had no idea how high the cost would be. This content may violate our usage policies. Did we get it wrong? Please tell us by giving this response a thumbs down. I woke to the soft glow of dawn filtering through the sheer curtains, casting golden slants of light across the room. The sheets beneath me smelled of whiskey, sweat, and him. A scent that clung to my skin, branding me in a way that felt both exhilarating and damning. My body ached in places I hadn't felt in years, a slow, delicious reminder of everything that had happened in the hushed hours of the night. But the warmth of his body beside me was what struck me first, the solid presence of Jake, still tangled in the sheets, one arm draped lazily over my waist. Reality came crashing down like a tidal wave, washing away the remnants of bliss that had carried me through the night. My stomach twisted, my breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that this wasn't real, that I hadn't done what I had just done, that I hadn't just crossed a line I could never uncross. But Jake stirred beside me, his fingers flexing against my hip, and suddenly, the weight of my choices felt suffocating. I needed to leave. Carefully, I slid out from beneath his arm, moving as silently as I could, though every rustle of fabric felt deafening. My heart pounded as I gathered my clothes, piece by piece, my fingers trembling as I slipped back into the dress that had once made me feel sexy, but now felt like a scarlet letter clinging to my skin. I risked a glance at him, my pulse hammering. He was still asleep, his breathing even, the faintest shadow of a smirk still lingering on his lips. Even now, in the quiet of morning, he looked at peace, completely unbothered, completely at ease. But I wasn't. I wasn't at ease at all. I turned, slipping out the door without another look back. The hallway was silent, the floor cool against my bare feet as I moved toward the stairs, my mind spinning, my emotions tangled in knots I didn't know how to undo. My wedding ring felt like it was burning a hole in my purse, where I had tucked it away last night, a symbol of everything I had just shattered. By the time I reached the bar downstairs, it was empty, the scent of stale alcohol clinging to the air. The neon signs were dimmed, the chairs still flipped onto the tables from closing. It felt eerily quiet, like I had stepped into another world entirely, one where last night hadn't happened, one where I was still the woman I had been before I walked through that door. But I wasn't her anymore. The cold morning air hit me like a slap when I stepped outside, the city still groggy, just beginning to wake. I wrapped my arms around myself, not from the chill, but from the sheer weight of what I had done. My legs felt weak, unsteady, as I hurried toward my car, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I needed to get home. Home. The word felt foreign now, like it belonged to another person, another life. I didn't know what home was anymore. The drive felt endless, though it was only a few miles. Every red light, every quiet intersection was another chance for my thoughts to creep in, for the reality of what I had done to settle deeper into my bones. My body still felt like his hands were still on me, like his lips had left permanent marks against my skin. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my breaths shallow as I pulled onto my street, my house coming into view. Mark's car was in the driveway. A fresh wave of nausea rolled through me. I had spent the night in another man's bed, and my husband had no idea. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I pulled into my usual spot, cutting the engine. My hands refused to move from the wheel. My chest felt tight, my pulse erratic, and for a split second, I thought about just driving away, about leaving, about running from all of this before it caught up with me. But I didn't. Instead, I forced myself out of the car, forced myself up the steps, forced myself to slide my key into the lock and turn it, as if I was still the woman who belonged here. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made my skin prickle. I shut the door behind me, my breath catching when I spotted Mark standing in the kitchen, a mug of coffee in his hands, his gaze already on me. He was still in his sweatpants, his hair slightly tousled like he had just woken up. But his expression wasn't tired. It wasn't groggy. It was sharp, alert, aware. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Where were you?" His voice was calm, measured, but there was something underneath it, something dark, something dangerous. My mouth opened, but no words came out. I had never been good at lying. Mark took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. "Your phone was off." My stomach twisted violently. I had turned it off last night, wanting to forget everything, wanting to disappear into the world Jake had created for me. And now there was no excuse, no reasonable explanation. My voice cracked, my throat too tight, too dry. But I didn't have an answer. Not one he would believe. Not one that wasn't a lie. And from the way he was looking at me, from the way his fingers tightened slightly around the handle of his mug, I knew. He already knew the truth. Mark's eyes didn't leave mine as I stood frozen in the doorway, my breath caught in my throat, my pulse thundering in my ears. The weight of his gaze was unbearable, suffocating, pressing against my chest like a vice. My body still ached from last night, from Jake, from everything I had done, and the worst part was, I could still feel him on me. The ghost of his touch, the warmth of his skin, the way he made me feel. And now, standing here, facing my husband, it felt like the evidence of my betrayal was written all over me. My heart clenched as I tried to find the right words, but nothing came. There was no easy lie, no excuse that would erase the tension in the air, no way to pretend that I hadn't spent the night in another man's bed. Mark took another slow sip of his coffee, the quiet sound of it grating against my nerves. "Well?" I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around my purse strap as if it could anchor me. I went out for a drink," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I needed some air." A humorless chuckle left his lips, the kind that made my stomach churn. He set his mug down on the counter with a soft clink, his movements slow, controlled, too calm. "Right. A drink?" His head tilted slightly, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "And what? You just forgot to come home?" I opened my mouth, then closed it, my throat tightening. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, charged with something volatile. Mark exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face before shaking his head. "You know, I didn't expect much when I woke up this morning. Just the usual. Coffee, emails, another day of pretending we're okay. But what I didn't expect was to roll over and realize my wife never came home last night." He let out a bitter laugh. "So tell me, Laura, how does that happen?" My chest ached as I struggled to breathe, my mind spinning, trying to find a way out of this. But there was no way out. He wasn't a fool. He had already pieced it together. He just wanted to hear me say it. My voice cracked, and I hated how small I sounded. It wasn't like that. Mark's jaw clenched. Then, what was it like? I didn't have an answer. His silence was worse than if he had yelled. I could see the muscles in his arms tensing, his fingers pressing into the counter like he was holding himself together by a thread. My stomach twisted violently, nausea rolling through me in waves. "I made a mistake," I whispered, the words cutting through me as much as they cut through him. Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "A mistake." His eyes flashed with something dark, something I couldn't bear to name. "Tell me, Laura, at what point did it become a mistake? Was it when you walked into that bar, when you let him touch you, when you—" He stopped himself, exhaling sharply, like saying it out loud was too much. "Or was it this morning, when you realized you had to come home and look me in the eye?" Tears burned at the back of my throat. "Mark, don't—" He cut me off, his voice sharp, raw. He ran a hand through his hair, his expression shifting from anger to something else, something worse. "Hurt. Don't stand there and say my name like it means something to you." The pain in his voice nearly shattered me. I took a step closer, but he immediately stiffened, his whole body coiled tight, like he was trying to keep himself from coming undone. "I didn't mean to—" "Don't say that either," he snapped, his voice like a whip. "Don't tell me you didn't mean to cheat on me, because that's not how it works, Laura. You don't just fall into someone else's bed by accident." I swallowed back a sob, my chest heaving. I was lonely. The confession spilled from my lips before I could stop it, before I could think of something softer, something that wouldn't twist the knife deeper. Mark let out a breath, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. "Lonely." He said it like it was the most pathetic excuse he had ever heard. My hands shook at my sides. "Mark, You know what's funny?" He let out a bitter laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I knew something was wrong. I knew for a long time. And I kept telling myself it was just a rough patch, that maybe you just needed time. But all along, you were just waiting for an opportunity, weren't you?" I shook my head desperately. "No, that's not true." His eyes bore into mine. "Then why—" His voice cracked at the end, and my heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. "Why did you do this?" Tears slipped down my cheeks before I could stop them. "Because I needed to feel something again." Silence. Mark just stood there, his chest rising and falling, his hands braced against the counter, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His expression was unreadable, his body tense, his lips pressed into a thin, hard line. I waited for him to scream, to break something, to lash out with all the fury I deserved. But instead, he just let out a slow, heavy breath. "I want you to leave." The words sliced through me like a blade. I blinked, my heart lurching. "What?" Mark's jaw was tight, his fists clenched. I need you to get out. What? No. His voice was firm, his tone final. You don't get to stand here and cry, Laura. You don't get to act like you're the one who's been hurt. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something break in them. I can't look at you right now, so go. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My body felt numb, hollow, like I had already started floating away from the life I had just destroyed. Please, I whispered, my voice trembling. Mark didn't move, didn't soften, didn't reach for me. The man who had once promised to love me forever now couldn't even bear to look at me. I had shattered us beyond repair, and there was nothing left to save. The walls of my home felt foreign as I stood in the bedroom, staring at the half-packed suitcase on the bed. Everything around me had once been mine. The carefully chosen throw pillows, the framed wedding photos on the nightstand, the closet full of clothes I had once worn in a life that now felt like a stranger's. But none of it felt like it belonged to me anymore. Or maybe I was the one who no longer belonged here. Mark's voice still echoed in my head. I need you to get out. I had expected rage. I had expected shouting, accusations, maybe even things being thrown. But the quiet devastation in his voice, the cold, detached way he had told me to leave, it had hurt far more than anger ever could. I glanced toward the nightstand. The framed wedding photo sat there, untouched. In the picture, Mark had his arm around me, his smile easy, his eyes bright, with something I hadn't seen in years. And God, I looked so happy. I had been laughing when the picture was taken, caught mid-moment, my head tilted toward him like he was the only thing in the world. That woman didn't exist anymore. I turned the frame face down. The house was silent. No footsteps, no murmurs of the TV from the living room, no sounds of Mark moving around downstairs. I didn't know where he had gone after telling me to leave, and a part of me feared that this silence meant he wasn't coming back anytime soon. Maybe that was for the best. I zipped the suitcase, my hands trembling slightly. It felt surreal, like I was watching myself from outside my own body. Packing a bag, leaving my home. These were things other people did, things that happened in dramatic movies, not in my real life. And yet here I was, a woman who had set her life on fire, now gathering the ashes and trying to figure out where to go next. I dragged my suitcase toward the front door, my breath shaky. My fingers hesitated on the handle, gripping it tightly. I had thought about leaving Mark before, so many times over the years, in moments of loneliness, in nights spent lying awake beside a man who felt like a stranger. But I had never truly imagined this. Walking out, knowing I couldn't come back. The weight of finality pressed down on me. I turned the knob and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the sky a muted gray, as if the world itself had dulled to match the emptiness in my chest. I didn't know where I was going. I had no plan, no idea what came next. I had a car, some money, and a phone filled with unanswered texts from Jake. The thought of him sent a sharp pang through me. I hadn't responded to him since I left his loft that morning. He had sent a few messages, casual at first, asking if I had gotten home safe. Then, when I didn't answer, another one. Laura, talk to me. I hadn't. Because what was there to say? That what happened between us had been everything I needed in the moment, but now all it had left behind was destruction. That I didn't regret what we did, but I regretted the wreckage it had caused. I had never lied to Jake, not once. But now I didn't even know if I had the strength to tell him the truth. I exhaled shakily and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was cold beneath me as I sat there, staring at the steering wheel, my hands gripping it like it was the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart. I could go anywhere, and yet I had nowhere to go. I should have been crying. I should have been feeling something, but all I felt was empty. I turned the key in the ignition. As I pulled out of the driveway, I didn't look back at the house. I drove without a destination, without thinking. The streets blurred together, the city passing me by in streaks of gray and muted neon. I wasn't ready to go to a hotel, wasn't ready to be alone with my thoughts. So I just drove, letting the road carry me away from everything I had known. I didn't even realize where I was going until I pulled up outside the bar. Jake's bar. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, the same dull glow that had welcomed me inside the night I had made the worst, or maybe the most honest, decision of my life. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my fingers drumming anxiously against the steering wheel. This was a bad idea, but I wasn't sure I had any good ones left. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the car. The moment I pushed open the door, Jake's eyes locked onto mine. He was behind the bar, a glass in his hand, but whatever conversation he had been having stopped mid-sentence. His expression shifted, his usual mask of calm slipping for the briefest second before he set down the glass and made his way toward me. I stood there, my hands clenched at my sides, my throat tight. "You're here," he said, his voice quieter than I expected. I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak just yet. Jake studied me, his gaze searching. "What happened?" I let out a shaky breath. "He knows." He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. A muscle ticked in Jake's jaw. He glanced away for a second, exhaling slowly before looking back at me. "And no?" I swallowed hard, my hands gripping the edge of the bar. "I don't know." Jake nodded slightly, as if he understood. Maybe he did. For a long moment, we just stood there, the weight of the night, of the past, of every choice I had made pressing down on us. And then, quietly, he reached across the bar and took my hand. Not demanding, not pulling, just offering. I looked down at our hands, at the contrast of his rough fingers against my skin. I could walk away. I could go to a hotel, figure out my next steps, try to rebuild my life from the ground up. Or I could take his hand. I looked up at him, at the man who had seen me at my most vulnerable, at the man who had made me feel something again. Jake didn't speak. He didn't tell me what to do. He just waited. And for the first time in a long time, I made a choice. I took his hand. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know if this was the right decision or just another mistake waiting to happen. But for now, for this moment, I let myself choose him. And whatever came next, I would face it when it came. Mark knew. He hadn't said the words, but I had seen it in his face, heard it in his voice, the betrayal, the disappointment, the finality of it. There was no fixing what I had done, no taking it back. I had broken us, shattered everything we had built, and now all that was left was the wreckage. I squeezed my eyes shut, my fingers pressing into my arms. What the hell was I doing here? The door behind me creaked open, and I knew, before I even turned around, that it was him. Jake didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, close enough that I could feel his presence, his heat, but not touching me. "You don't have to run," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. I think I already did. Jake exhaled, and I could feel the weight of his gaze on me. "Where are you going?" The question hung in the air between us. Heavy, charged. I turned to face him, my chest tight. "I don't know." Jake nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Then don't go." The simplicity of his words nearly knocked the air out of me. I looked away, my hands trembling at my sides. "It's not that simple, isn't it?" I let out a breath, shaking my head. Mark told me to leave. Jake's jaw tightened slightly. So you did. I swallowed hard. I had to. Did you? His voice was calm, measured, but there was something underneath it, something deeper. Or did you want to? The question sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over me. I had spent so long convincing myself that my marriage was salvageable, that I had to try, that I owed it to Mark, to our history, to everything we had built. But the truth was, I had been slipping away for years, long before I ever walked into this bar. I had wanted to leave, I just hadn't been brave enough to admit it. Jake stepped closer, his voice lower now. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to do anything. But if you're standing here, right now, telling me you don't know where to go, his eyes held mine, unflinching, then stay. My heart clenched painfully. With you? Jake's lips curved slightly, the ghost of a smirk. Yeah. My throat tightened, my breath shaky. This was it, the choice, the real one. I could leave. I could get in my car, find a hotel, disappear for a few days while I figured out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I could try to fix things with Mark, even though I knew, deep down, that it was too late. Or I could stay, with Jake. The thought sent a rush of something electric through me. Fear, excitement, longing. I exhaled slowly. What happens if I do? Jake's smirk faded, his expression turning serious. That's up to you. I hesitated, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Then, before I could change my mind, before I could let logic talk me out of it, I nodded. Jake didn't say anything. He just reached for my hand again, his fingers warm, solid, steady. And this time, I didn't let go. Jake's loft was the same as it had been the night before. Dimly lit, quiet, filled with the faint scent of whiskey and something distinctly him. But this time, it felt different. This time, I wasn't just passing through, wasn't just here for one reckless night. I was staying. The realization sent a ripple of unease through me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my fingers gripping the hem of my dress, my mind racing. Jake was across the room, leaning against the counter, watching me carefully. He hadn't asked any questions, hadn't demanded answers I wasn't ready to give. He was just waiting. You can take the bed, he said finally, his voice quiet. I'll take the couch. I looked up, startled. You don't have to. Jake shook his head. It's not about what I have to do. His gaze was steady. It's about what you want. The words sent a shiver through me. I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know if I was here because I wanted him or because I had nowhere else to go. I didn't know if this was another mistake or if it was the first real decision I had made for myself in years. But when I met Jake's eyes, when I saw the quiet patience there, the way he wasn't pushing, wasn't assuming, I knew I needed to be here, even if just for tonight. I exhaled slowly. Stay with me. Jake didn't move at first. Then, after a long moment, he nodded. He crossed the room, sat beside me on the bed, not touching, not crowding, just there. I turned to face him, my throat tight. This is insane. Jake smirked. Yeah. I let out a shaky laugh, my chest aching. I don't know what I'm doing. He reached up, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, his touch light. Then stop thinking. And for the first time in a long time, I did. The first few nights at Jake's loft felt like existing in a different reality, one where the weight of my out beneath us, flickering lights and the distant hum of traffic, and for the first time in a long time, I felt small, insignificant in a way that was almost comforting. You ever think about just disappearing? I asked, my voice barely audible over the breeze. Jake took a sip from the bottle before passing it to me. Yeah. I tilted my head, studying him. And? His smirk was lazy, unreadable, didn't seem worth the trouble. I let out a soft laugh, taking a long drink, feeling the burn slide down my throat. I think about it all the time. Jake didn't respond right away. Instead, he shifted so he was facing me fully, his gaze sharp, searching. So why don't you? I exhaled, my fingers tightening around the bottle. Because disappearing means leaving everything behind. And no matter how much I try to pretend otherwise, there's still a part of me that's afraid to do that. Jake nodded slowly, as if he understood. Maybe he did. We sat there in silence, the city stretching below us, the whiskey warming my veins. For a moment, I let myself imagine what it would be like to start over, to erase the past, rewrite myself into someone new, someone untouched by regret. But the fantasy was just that, a fantasy. The next morning, reality crept back in. I woke to the sound of Jake moving around in the kitchen, the scent of coffee drifting through the loft. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, my body heavy with exhaustion. I had been running, not just from Mark, but from the consequences of what I had done. I sat up slowly, pulling the sheets around me, my heart pounding. The night before had felt like something out of a dream, a stolen moment where nothing outside of this loft existed. But morning had a way of reminding me that reality was still waiting. I needed to stop pretending I didn't have to face it. Jake must have sensed the shift in me because when I stepped into the kitchen, his expression was different. He leaned against the counter, mug in hand, studying me carefully. "You're leaving?" he said, not a question. I swallowed hard, my fingers curling around the edge of the counter. Yeah. He didn't argue. He didn't try to stop me. Instead, he simply nodded, taking another sip of his coffee. "Where are you going?" I let out a slow breath. "I don't know." Jake set his mug down, crossing his arms over his chest. "Back to him?" The question hit like a punch to the gut. I shook my head. "No, that's over." Jake nodded again, his expression unreadable. "Good." I hesitated. "Are you—" "I'm not mad." He cut in before I could finish. "I knew you weren't here forever." The words should have made me feel relieved, but instead they sent a strange ache through me. I stepped closer, my fingers brushing against his on the counter. "Jake," he exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "Don't say something just because you feel like you should." I swallowed, my throat tight. This man had given me something I hadn't even known I needed, and now I was walking away. But I had to, because no matter how much I wanted to pretend I could rewrite my story with him, I couldn't. I needed to figure out who I was on my own. I reached for my bag, slinging it over my shoulder. Jake's eyes lingered on me for a long moment before he finally said, "If you ever need another drink." I smiled faintly, my chest aching. "I know where to find you." And then, without another word, I walked out the door. The sun was rising as I stepped outside, the air crisp and cool. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, breathing in, exhaling slowly, trying to ground myself. For the first time in years, I had no plan, no idea where I was going. And maybe for the first time, that was exactly what I needed. I had made mistakes. I had burned bridges. But I wasn't disappearing. Not yet. I tightened my grip on my bag and started walking. The first few nights at Jake's loft felt like existing in a different reality, one where the weight of my marriage, my betrayal, and everything I had destroyed didn't exist. Here, in this dimly lit space that smelled of whiskey and something distinctly him, I wasn't a wife who had shattered vows. I wasn't the woman who had been asked to leave her home. I was just Laura, a woman trying to forget. Jake never asked for details. He never pressed. Maybe that was why I stayed longer than I should have. He let me exist in silence, let me sit by the window at night with a drink in my hand, let me curl into his bed without asking if I would still be there in the morning. It was strange, this quiet understanding between us. Like he knew that I was on the edge of something and he wasn't going to push me over. On the third night, we ended up on the rooftop. Jake had led me up a narrow stairwell, a bottle of whiskey in one hand, his other laced loosely with mine. The city stretched out beneath us, flickering lights and the distant hum of traffic, and for the first time in a long time, I felt small, insignificant in a way that was almost comforting. You ever think about just disappearing? I asked, my voice barely audible over the breeze. Jake took a sip from the bottle before passing it to me. Yeah. I tilted my head, studying him. And his smirk was lazy, unreadable. Didn't seem worth the trouble. I let out a soft laugh, taking a long drink, feeling the burn slide down my throat. I think about it all the time. Jake didn't respond right away. Instead, he shifted so he was facing me fully, his gaze sharp, searching. So why don't you? I exhaled, my fingers tightening around the bottle. Because disappearing means leaving everything behind, and no matter how much I try to pretend otherwise, there's still a part of me that's afraid to do that. Jake nodded slowly, as if he understood. Maybe he did. We sat there in silence, the city stretching below us, the whiskey warming my veins. For a moment, I let myself imagine what it would be like to start over, to erase the past, rewrite myself into someone new, someone untouched by regret. But the fantasy was just that, a fantasy. The next morning, reality crept back in. I woke to the sound of Jake moving around in the kitchen, the scent of coffee drifting through the loft. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, my body heavy with exhaustion. I had been running, not just from Mark, but from the consequences of what I had done. I sat up slowly, pulling the sheets around me, my heart pounding. The night before had felt like something out of a dream, a stolen moment where nothing outside of this loft existed. But morning had a way of reminding me that reality was still waiting. I needed to stop pretending I didn't have to face it. Jake must have sensed the shift in me, because when I stepped into the kitchen, his expression was different. He leaned against the counter, mug in hand, studying me carefully. "You're leaving?" he said, not a question. I swallowed hard, my fingers curling around the edge of the counter. Yeah. He didn't argue. He didn't try to stop me. Instead, he simply nodded, taking another sip of his coffee. "Where are you going?" I let out a slow breath. "I don't know." Jake set his mug down, crossing his arms over his chest. "Back to him?" The question hit like a punch to the gut. I shook my head. "No, that's over." Jake nodded again, his expression unreadable. "Good." I hesitated. "Are you—" "I'm not mad." He cut in before I could finish. "I knew you weren't here forever." The words should have made me feel relieved, but instead they sent a strange ache through me. I stepped closer, my fingers brushing against his on the counter. "Jake?" He exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "Don't say something just because you feel like you should." I swallowed, my throat tight. This man had given me something I hadn't even known I needed, and now I was walking away. But I had to, because no matter how much I wanted to pretend I could rewrite my story with him, I couldn't. I needed to figure out who I was on my own. I reached for my bag, slinging it over my shoulder. Jake's eyes lingered on me for a long moment before he finally said, "If you ever need another drink." I smiled faintly, my chest aching. I know where to find you. And then, without another word, I walked out the door. The sun was rising as I stepped outside, the air crisp and cool. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, breathing in, exhaling slowly, trying to ground myself. For the first time in years, I had no plan, no idea where I was going. And maybe, for the first time, that was exactly what I needed. I had made mistakes. I had burned bridges. But I wasn't disappearing. Yet, I had left Mark, I had left Jake, and now, for the first time in years, I was truly alone. Where are you? A simple question. I stared at it for a long time, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I could tell him the truth, that I was in between places, that I didn't have a destination yet, but what would that change? Would he ask me to come back? Would I even want him to? I locked my phone and stuffed it into my bag. Mark was my past. Jake, maybe he was never supposed to be anything more than a wake-up call. I walked aimlessly, passing rows of coffee shops, bookstores, strangers living lives that felt impossibly normal. It was a strange thing, realizing that the world hadn't stopped just because mine had shattered. I stopped in front of a small cafe, drawn in by the scent of fresh coffee and the sound of quiet jazz humming from inside. The place was nearly empty, just a few scattered patrons lost in their own thoughts. I slid into a booth by the window, ordering a black coffee, something simple, something grounding. I needed to think, who was I now? For years, my identity had been woven into my marriage, into the version of myself I had created to fit within it. But now, stripped of that, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. I had thought that stepping out of my old life would feel like freedom. But freedom came with uncertainty, and uncertainty was terrifying. I wrapped my hands around the warm coffee cup, staring out the window, watching the world move without me. Maybe I needed to stop running. Maybe I needed to face everything, even the ugly, painful parts. I reached for my phone again. This time I didn't hesitate. I typed out a message. We need to talk. I stared at it for a long time before pressing send. And then I exhaled. Maybe this wasn't the ending. Maybe it was just the beginning.